not too long ago, I happened upon a post in a group entitled Episcopalians on Facebook. And it was a very naive post. And sometimes naivete really shares the truth, a basic truth. And this person wrote a very simple sentence with no explanation. The person wrote, "I think I would like to become a deacon." And I thought, well, that's all well and good. I know exactly where you're coming from. But the reality is that you don't become a deacon. You are a deacon already. And then your community recognizes it. But that's another talk that we'll get to in my next video. So for today, and the information I would like to pass on to that person who wrote that comment is that before you can even think about that type of thing, you have to go through a period of not spiritual discernment, because discernment has to do with you. It's very egocentric in a way. What you want to do is spend some time and learn the habit and the techniques and find what works for you surrounding spiritual contemplation, which is far different from calling it discernment. Now, before I talk about anything, I just want to put up a warning. Not a warning, but an apology. I'm going to use language that may sound kind of new age. It may seem like kind of way out there. But honestly, that's the only language we have to discuss that intimacy within spirituality. Spirituality is somewhat feeling-based, but it also incorporates the head, sometimes the head and the heart independently, sometimes the head and the heart joining. But it's all this language of solitude. And to share that language of solitude is sometimes very difficult, so please forgive me. So my goal today is just to give you a spark, and if you need it, permission to open the door to spiritual contemplation, just a crack, so you could consider taking a step and entering into that room. Spiritual contemplation is something that not only changes yourself, it changes your perceptions of the world, it changes your understanding of people around you, it changes the depth and breadth of worship on Sundays as you attend Mass. And it really has nothing to do with doctrines or creeds or prayers that you particularly like. Spiritual contemplation is freedom to join in what Richard Rohr calls in his latest book, The Divine Dance. He asks if you could understand and join into the flow. And that's the term he uses for the Trinity. And as you get into this, you might be able to have a new understanding of God. You might start to consider the question as Jesus asked, "Who do you say that I am?" You might start to see the involvement of the Holy Spirit in people's lives without them actually even knowing it. Or you might start to feel the Holy Spirit working in your life and finally get a glimpse of understanding of what it's calling you to do. That, my friends, cannot happen on Sundays when you're in the midst of a worship experience. That was designed to be a communal experience. But contemplation happens by yourself in whatever ways you figure out is the place that God best speaks to you. If I had to come up with another definition or a means to explain spiritual contemplation, it means that when you begin this process, you enter into a series of moments which further helps you in the nature of becoming. And that's an important thing to realize. Because when you get involved in spiritual contemplation, you join into this eternal flow of becoming. And I can't tell you what you will become. I don't know what I am becoming, but I do know through this spiritual practice that you do enter into the full breadth and depth of becoming. And this is a process that will continue for the rest of your life. So you may wonder, how does this process begin? How do you begin to find your baby steps within the practice of spiritual contemplation? Well, that's your choice. I was having a conversation with my rector, the Reverend Amy Pringle, at the church where I serve at St. George's, and I told her about this video. So I asked, okay, what advice would you give? And it was very similar to what I had been thinking. Her suggestion was figure out where you feel most connected with God. And I will add, the flow of God. She also said a very, very astute comment. She goes, think of the place where God just gets in your way. Because God tends to do that. Think back biblically. Here was Abraham, who was all settled with his wife Sarah. He had his flocks, he had a very content life, and he was, ready to collect Social Security upon retirement. And then God started a journey. So where does God get in your way? Where does God do that? That might take some experimentation, or you might know exactly where it is. For me, I'll share you mine. It's something that I realized I had been doing for a long time. And we'll talk about this self-examination when we go into our next video next month. But there are two things that get me connected to God so I can commune. Remember, it's not asking God questions or asking for purpose. It's simply being, so you can join into your eternal becoming. Well, for me, I'm not a big quiet guy. With my background in music, it's literally impossible for me to turn new music off in my head. Melodies come to me, and sometimes complete orchestral works come to me automatically. It just happens. So early on, I started to devise as a spiritual discipline, which came about from my need to commune with God contemplatively. I started to produce these musical meditations, drawing from different traditions. And there are certain traditions of music that I found called me deeply into contemplation. And then the other thing I realized was that even when I was 9 and 10 years old, my parents and my family would rent a beach house in Newport Beach, right on the beach during the summer. And one of the practices I found at that age was waking up right at sunrise or just before. And I would throw on a sweatshirt, a pair of shorts, tennis shoes, or maybe barefoot. And I would go out and just walk the beach as the sun rose. Maybe I would walk 45 minutes or more. I remember the one house was right near the jetty in Newport, and way down there was the pier, Newport Pier, and I believe I walked the whole distance and back. It was maybe a good hour's complete walk, and it was the rhythm of the ocean that set me in. The smells, the sounds of the seagulls, the waves hitting the sand, and that hiss that would come as the water pulled out again. But the key word in this was walking. So what I found worked for me was walking. I prefer to walk at night, actually, at sundown, or after I've eaten dinner. I will call it my constitutional, but what I do is I have my collection of music, and I mostly have my head down, and with my audio senses completely filled, that takes me to that spot. And I just simply walk. But that's my spot that I figured out. So what you have to do, through experimentation maybe, is find that spot where God gets in your way. Now the last piece is for those who like to read books or to take a test. And I think I would just like to give a couple of suggestions. Now, one book I think will help you a lot. It's called Falling Upward by Father Richard Rohr. And it talks about the first half of life and the second half of life. And it has nothing to do with age. But it talks about how one is ready to embrace a life of spiritual contemplation. So I think that may be a good book to read as you begin this process, because it talks about your container. What was in your container growing up? What did you save? You know, it talks about certitude. What things are you certain about? Because as you are able to enter into spiritual contemplation of a higher level, you start to remove the things from that container that no longer matter. and you no longer think of yourself as a person who embraces dualistic thinking. You start to think much broader. So that would be a good book to help you examine yourself. Another exercise that will be helpful for you, just to give yourself permission to be who you are, so that you may enter into the nature of becoming. There's that talk again. I think it'd be a good thing for you to go online and find a site that will give you the Myers-Briggs test. This is a personality type. And I believe it's very accurate. I've had to take the Myers-Briggs a few times during my process towards ordination. And it's turned out pretty much the same all but once. And it surprised me. But every time I've taken the test, I come up being an INFJ. You can look up what those things are. And only once after I completed seminary, just prior to ordination, I took it again. They asked me to take it again, and I ended up with an ENFJ, which means that you communicate more verbally with words. I went, that's not me. And they said, well, it's probably a result of all the training you've been through and you've had to express yourself more. But to be honest, I took it again not too long ago, and I'm right back to my INFJ. So take that test. You can find it. You can Google it. Just find that's higher in the ranking, and learn a little bit about yourself, because that will help you find the atmosphere that will be conducive to begin spiritual contemplation. So that's all I've got for you this month. I hope you sparked some interest in thinking about contemplation and how this might be a process that would be beneficial to you and for you in your spiritual life. I hope I gave you permission to forget the church for a little bit, forget what you've been taught, forget all those doctrines that will be extra baggage for you. Just set that aside and learn to become yourself in the stillness of God, to embrace what I like to call spiritual and sacred ambiguity. Because when you enter into a contemplative life, ambiguity becomes your friend. It's no longer an enemy. So that's all I have for you. I'll see you next month when we talk about how contemplation led to the process of me becoming and being recognized as a deacon in the church. So see you next month, and until then, be well, be happy, God bless, and bye-bye.